This is Ivan Ivanov, and you are watching UFO Disclosure Bulgaria. We have the documents. We have the witnesses. True stories about UFOs, visitors from outer space, and other worlds.
My name's Nik Pope. I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and for much of the early 90s I was posted to a division where my duties included researching and investigating the UFO phenomenon and assessing whether there was anything that constituted a threat to the defence of the United Kingdom or was of more general scientific or technical interest.
How you enjoying this team for UFO research in the Ministry of Defense? You was invited or what happened?
I had no previous knowledge or experience or interest in this subject, but in the Ministry of Defense, the career progression, the posting policy is that you would be given a new job either on level transfer or on promotion every 2 or 3 years, and that's the way that the personnel policy department handled things at the time. So in 1991 I was due for a move, and a number of positions came up and I was offered this one. I had just finished working alongside a particular manager in the first Gulf War, and he'd been impressed with my work. He had the vacancy and he said, "Do you want the job?" And I said, "What is the job?" And he said, "UFOs." And I said, "Well, okay, I will give it a go." So I was, I suppose, headhunted into that position.
Have you heard before about UFO or?
I had very little previous knowledge about this, and indeed, until I joined the Ministry of Defence, I had no idea that they even investigated the phenomenon. It was only one day when I was leafing through the telephone directory, which itself was a classified document, and it had all the names of the different personnel and a brief description of their duties, and I just accidentally turned to a page and it said UFOs, and I remember thinking at the time, oh, how bizarre that somebody is looking at that. And little did I know that a couple of years later I would be doing that very job. It's, I suppose, one of life's little synchronicities.
So you work with a lot of documents, and I mean, they're not fake. There's real stories, right? Oh,
every day at that job we created documents when we wrote up reports or we corresponded with other parts of the department, and now the British government is itself declassifying and releasing a lot of this material and sending it to the National Archives. And so when I talk about this, firstly, I'm not a whistleblower. I'm talking about this because the government has itself released this material. And secondly, and very importantly, this is a subject where, unfortunately, there are people who make bogus claims about their involvement with this subject, and there are people who fake documents. But fortunately, everything that I talk about can be checked on the website of the National Archives, and all the cases that I investigated, and of course a lot of documents that I wrote myself have now been declassified and released. So there is a paper trail that researchers can follow to piece together the story of the British government's UFO project.
Do you know so far how many sightings you had in England? I mean, in the UK?
The Ministry of Defence, over the time period that their UFO project ran, which was 1953 through to 2009, investigated around 12,000 cases. And the real figure, though, of course, is much higher. Those were just the cases that were reported to the Ministry of Defence. But other people would report to the media. Some people would report to UFO research groups and organisations. And of course, a vast percentage of people who see a UFO don't report it to anybody, either because they don't know who to contact or because they fear being disbelieved or ridiculed. So when I say that the Ministry of Defence had investigated 12,000 cases, we can only guess at the true numbers in the United Kingdom, but I suspect it's several hundred thousand.
What happened in 1953, or just is coincident for Ministry of Defense to start these investigations for UFO? Something specific happening in 1953, or?
The reason the Ministry of Defence UFO project started in 1953 was really in response to a big wave of UFO sightings that had occurred in 1952. And a lot of the witnesses, certainly in British cases, were actually military personnel. Royal Air Force pilots had seen objects that they were not able to identify. In some cases they had attempted to chase these objects, but the UFOs were faster and more maneuverable. And in some cases those incidents were also documented on military radar, and the radar operators simultaneously were tracking them. So there was very good, solid evidence. And indeed, there was also some gun camera footage taken. So in response to that, the Ministry of Defence, which was of course aware of the UFO mystery and had been since the 40s, but at that point in 1953, the Ministry of Defence felt that a more formal investigative program was needed.
What was that case who fascinating you investigated about UFO, or maybe something like that?
I think the case that interested me most personally, that occurred during my time on the project, which was 1991 through to 1994, was a case from March of 93, when over a series of period of about 6 hours, we had multiple sightings throughout different locations in the UK, and again, many of the witnesses were police officers, pilots, military personnel.
So they're solid witnesses.
Very solid witnesses, very credible. And 2 RAF bases, so the British Royal Air Force, Cosford and Shawbury, were directly overflown by a UFO. And one of the witnesses, who was a meteorological officer, described to me that this was triangular, midway in size between a C-130 transport aircraft and a Boeing 747, maybe no more than 200 feet above the ground, and almost completely silent. He just said that there was a low-frequency humming sound, very unpleasant, that he could feel reverberating through his body, but almost completely silent apart from that. He said this was moving very slowly, maybe no more than 30 or 40 miles an hour. And a narrow beam of light was shining down at the ground and tracking backwards and forwards as if this object was looking for something. And then the light retracted, and from this very slow speed, the UFO then shot off to the horizon at incredible speed. And he said to me, by way of comparison, he said, imagine something like the Red Arrows, which is the UK's military fast jet display team. Well, he said orders of magnitude above and beyond that. He said to me, look, Nick, he said, I've served 8 years in the Air Force. I see helicopters and military jets every day. He said, I've never seen anything like this before. And this was typical of we got many reports that night.
I think that maybe England is the most popular place in the world with all these crop circles. What do you think about this?
Well, we looked at the whole crop circle mystery because of the perceived link with UFOs. In the early days, of course, these were just simple circles. Then there was an evolution, and we had quintuplets, where you had a single circle and 4 satellite circles. Then you had the pictograms, more complex. Now, I looked at this, and we were not convinced by this. We felt that most of these were hoaxed. We did talk about getting some samples from within formations and then conducting scientific tests on them against a control sample from the same field but outside the pattern. I don't have visibility of whether that study actually took place, but I never saw anything which convinced me. But it was interesting, and I was certainly on a number of occasions, I think I was actually first into some of these formations. I believe, I think, now this was after I had left the UFO project, I believe, but I continued to maintain an interest and keep an eye on this. I think I was the first person to actually walk inside the Julia set, which I think was 2000, no it wasn't, it was 1996, just very close to Stonehenge, just off the A303, one of the big roads down to the west of England. So interesting, but I did not see any scientific data that convinced me.
Okay. Do you think there's some connections between Stonehenge you mentioned a few seconds ago and all the sightings there?
It's difficult to say what links there might be.
In your opinion?
Yeah, I am aware that people have speculated that there are links between, certainly in the UK, what you might call sacred sites. So Stonehenge, Avebury, Silbury Hill, those sorts of areas. And indeed, people all around the world say that UFOs seem to come to these locations. Now, this is pure speculation. I've heard people say that there are energies, maybe earth energies, in certain locations, and that's why these sites were favoured by our ancestors as places of worship. And maybe that's why UFOs come too. But I don't have anything that would validate that from my Ministry of Defence research and investigation. But it's an interesting theory, of course.
Yeah, so we know that UFO is real. They're coming from somewhere, I mean from different dimensions, maybe from different solar systems. What will be the next for humanity? I mean, we're talking about this in the conference, in the congress like this today, but what will be the next step of humanity maybe?
Well, I think a number of different things are happening, and I think one thing that I believe certainly our generation will see is absolute confirmation of the existence of extraterrestrial life, probably extraterrestrial intelligence. I think we're seeing now, when you look ahead to the next generation of telescopes, both optical and radio telescopes, and when you think about the existing ones, the Chinese, for example, have just brought a big radio telescope online. There is going to be the James Webb Space Telescope will be launched. We still have a lot of data from Kepler, of course, and the big one is the Square Kilometre Array radio telescope, which is going to be so powerful, effectively it will be able to pick up something equivalent to an airport radar at a distance of 50 light years. So of course the point about all this is, irrespective of what you believe the government knows about UFOs, and maybe the government's trying to suppress that information, we are very rapidly approaching the point where it will not be possible to suppress this information. You will simply bring these radio telescopes online, and these other civilizations, if they're out there, we'll find them.
Yeah.
We've been a detectable civilization, of course, for years because of our television and radio and certain military radar systems. So we'll be doing the same thing. We'll be switching on, and we'll be picking these people up.
What about if scientists looking in the wrong place, wrong path?
That's an interesting question. At the moment, we are perhaps being a little bit too anthropocentric with our perception. And when you look, for example, at the SETI Institute, and indeed when you look at NASA, and when people speculate about extraterrestrial life, we are a little bit too hung up on looking for Earth-like planets orbiting sun-like stars. And yes, I've heard that very point that you made mentioned at scientific conferences, where people say, hey, we should widen the search, we should look in the places that we don't expect. And one other point, any truly advanced civilization, and I'm talking significantly ahead of our level, will have huge energy requirements, and they will migrate to where they can find that energy. And one of the obvious places, of course, is in the vicinity of a black hole. So we should be looking very close to black holes, because truly advanced civilizations who will have unimaginable energy needs might go there to tap that energy. So that's a very good place to look.
Who's going to make this disclosure? The scientists, the governments? The governments or the people?
There are very few legal, actually there are no legally binding documents about who will disclose this. The SETI Institute and the astronomical community have what they call a declaration of principles that basically says that after the signal has been verified, if that's the way it's picked up, the scientist who makes the discovery, well, he or she gets to make the announcement. In reality, I suspect it would leak out on social media before that, and in reality, again, I suspect government would step in and make the announcement. And probably all governments would like to do it, but we have one interesting test case. A few years ago, when scientists believed they had discovered evidence of fossilized microbes on Mars, it was President Bill Clinton who made the announcement. So we have a model for what will happen, and that model suggests that it will be the President of the United States who makes the announcement.
Do you think European Union is more open, and maybe now is the time to create project for disclosure, to investigate all this stuff and be more open to the public?
I have long felt that UFOs, of course, it's an international issue. So many different countries have had their own UFO programs, but clearly there's a logic in collaborating, and maybe through a body like the European Union, but maybe through the United Nations. But this has been tried before, and frankly, the United Nations doesn't want this, and I'm not sure the EU does either. This is, we use the expression in the UK, it's a hot potato. Nobody wants to touch this.
Right.
It's toxic, this subject. I spoke a few years ago to the Malaysian astrophysicist who runs the United Nations Committee on Outer Space Affairs, and that's Dr. Maslin Othman. And she said if the scientific community, or if nations want to bring this to the United Nations, don't come to us until you have a consensus. And so the UN doesn't want to sort out a whole group of countries with different agendas on this and different perceptions. So yes, it's a logical decision to give this to the EU or the UN, but they don't want it.
Okay, and the last question, the truth is all out there or the truth is here?
Well, I definitely think the truth is out there. As to how much of it is down here, I think that remains to be seen, but we live in exciting times. We are seeing governments all around the world declassify and release UFO files and documents. We are seeing the next generation of telescopes, optical and radio, coming online, which will give us a window of the wider cosmos. And of course we have genuine, verifiable whistleblowers coming forward talking about this. Not all the people speaking out are genuine, of course, but some of them are. And for example, Luis Elizondo, when he spoke about the Pentagon's UFO study, the New York Times fact-checked that, and the Pentagon, a spokesperson, did confirm, yes, we had that program. So a lot of things are happening. Truth is out there, and I hope it's here, and if not, maybe it's coming soon.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Pope, and enjoying the conference. The Congress.
Thank you.